been pulling together notes, and Morgan Earp was recently working in my office and provided me with a lot of information, and I have some things that were said about Scott and at other venues. So I'm going to start with just a few things that I know and learned as I read through all this stuff, and then I'm going to get just a little more personal. But so I really started out knowing Scott a lot more professionally. So I knew that he had gotten his PhD through the JPSM program, which is really great because it's a program that we support, and we really like to see as many people go through that program as possible. But I know he also did a lot of things outside of just the stuff we see every day at BLS, through APOR, through various other conferences, through being a reviewer of manuscripts, and every time I read something, it was all about mentorship. It's about working with other people, and I am a big fan of that. And so it was really nice to hear so many other people saying that about Scott. So. But I also know that he worked on an awful lot of BLS programs, and so in recent years, the Consumer Expenditure Survey, the National Compensation Survey, and an awful lot of work on the Occupational Requirements Survey. And but I know that in his many years at BLS, that there were many programs. I don't mean to leave anything out. So one of the things that always impressed me was sort of the easy way that Scott interacted with sort of everybody and with every office. And so it's really nice to see that we have several people here from the Office of Field Operations, because one of the things that I always noticed was that Scott would be very comfortable working with regional office people. So you think you have sort of these highfalutin PhDs on one side, no offense to anybody in the room, and then really sort of day-to-day, hard-working, grinding out data collection people, and sort of, in some ways, two different worlds. And Scott seemed to move between those worlds really well, and I saw him build relationships and want to learn what the field economist's job was and what their challenges were, visiting field staff, learning their craft, and just building some good relationships. And I see some of those relationships in the room, which is terrific. So, but what I really got to know Scott very well soon after John Elting. It's nice to see him here. John Elting left the BLS to go to the Census Bureau, and we didn't have an associate commissioner. And so the four senior folks, Wendy and Polly and Bill and Jennifer, have done a terrific job. But one day, Wendy and Jennifer came to me and said, "Do you know that you have two other employees that work for you?" And this was getting very close to evaluation time, and they had sort of an ulterior motive to that. And so it turned out that Daniel Toth and Scott Fricker were direct reports to John Elting, and so apparently by default they were direct reports to me. And so by actually working on their evaluations, both Daniel and Scott, I got to know them a lot better, and I particularly got to know all the different work that Scott was doing. And again, in addition to that year, a lot of work on the ORS program and on other programs around BLS, but then time to do a lot of professional journals. And then over and over again, there was references to mentorship, to working with staff in OSMR and staff around the Bureau and in other places, in APOR and some of the other organizations, really helping people to hone their craft and to move up in the world a little bit. So I got to work closely with him and prepared his evaluation, work closely with him deciding what work he was going to work on over the next year. And he wasn't the easiest person to track down, because he was always sort of on a conference call or at a conference or busy or something, but we managed to find the time to really share information, and I certainly learned a lot. And so Daniel and Scott and I decided that we needed a staff meeting. And so we had great plans at the end of 2017 to plan a staff meeting at the Dubliner. And so, unfortunately, the tragedy struck, and so we never got to that. Although I will say that Daniel and I have lifted a couple of Irish beers in Scott's honor, and so it has been a pleasure to spend some time with Daniel as well. So, I did attend with many other people in this room Scott's funeral, where there was just this huge outpouring of support from BLS people, from many people high up in the statistical community, and that was really heartening to just see the number of people who Scott touched in his life, and to hear the stories of all the great work he had done. And then just recently, a few people in this room, and I was with them, we went on a walk for a couple miles in Reston, sort of in a celebration of the life of Scott and his wife, and stopped by a tree that had recently been planted in the neighborhood where they lived, and will be there as a memory for Scott and his wife. So that was sort of a nice remembrance, and this too, I think, is a really nice remembrance. And so I think Scott would be really pleased to have a library. So my guess is it backs up against his office over there. Maybe not quite sure. I didn't know where this was until a couple minutes ago. So, but what I noticed walking in the door is that his name is on the door. And so every time I walk down that hall, I can just smile and think of him. And I think he would want us to all, have good thoughts about the memories that we have and the good work that he did. So I want to say a special thank you to everyone who came, and a special thank you to the organizers. I think this is a terrific tribute, and I really, I know all of you, feel the same as I, miss him, and we're so pleased to have known him and all the great work that he did. So thanks everyone for coming.
And then Randall Powers is also going to say some words.
First, thanks to Jennifer Edgar for asking me to speak. I know there's, like many of you, could say many good words about Scott. So usually when I'm asked to speak at library dedications, I focus on the professional accomplishments of the honoree. Given what a whip-smart, professionally accomplished colleague Scott was, that's a speech practically all of us could give. I'm going to do his reading glasses thing here. And Bill just did quite wonderfully. Actually, a number of you here today are likely probably more qualified to give that speech than I am, having worked more closely with him. For many of us, myself included, Scott was much more than a respected colleague. Hence, I decided to take a more personal approach from the get-go. I'll also say that in the Powers household, Scott was fondly referred to as Fricker. Most likely because the name made for some really fun rhyming, and also because it was so frickin' fun to say. So forgive me if I lapse into calling him Fricker instead of Scott. October 14th, 1997. Those of you who are baseball fans may recall the Marlins winning their first NLCS on that date. Those of you who are fans of bad fiction may recall paperback writer Harold Robbins passing away on that day. Those of you who are fans of, I'm getting a little snobby here, but those of you who are fans of bad soft rock or the Baltimore Orioles were likely grieving the recent death of John Denver. And Dan Gilman probably recalls that that's the annual date of World Standards Day. But for me, I fondly recall that day as my first day at BLS and OSMR. The day I met Scott Fricker, a grizzled veteran himself of 2 weeks on the job. I was 30, new to the DC area, new to the profession, and though possessing a professional mindset, felt myself to be a bit of a square peg weirdo in button-down DC. Scott was 28, returning to the area as he grew up in, new to the profession as well, and appeared to be a cross between a genial hippie and a confident former homecoming king. If I recall correctly, he told me he had recently been traveling the country as a construction worker, building blockbuster video stores, which he readily admitted was his ticket to seeing the country, partying, and most importantly, chasing the ladies. Now with this new job opportunity, he had decided to get more serious about his life. I was quickly won over by his warm, charming, down-to-earth nature. We clicked and became fast friends. Over the ensuing years, we discovered complementary aspects of our personalities, as well as shared interests in life milestones, and our friendship blossomed. As time went by, in addition to being work compadres, we became hiking buddies, backcountry camping buddies, sporting event buddies, concert and film snob buddies, brewery visiting and craft beer happy hour buddies, home brewing buddies. We like beer! I never did get him to run a marathon with me, and he never got me on a motorcycle, but we shared a range of activities and interests that you'd usually expect to need 3 or 4 friends to cover. I met my future wife by answering a personal ad. Months later, he did the same. Our marital courtships overlapped, as did our wives' pregnancies. He was my dating coach and cheerleader, my marriage counselor, and my parenting confidant. Friends come and friends go, especially in DC, but he was the guy who I know who I'd be brewing beer with in Colorado 20 years from now. And sitting on one of our porches, toasting our days at BLS. He was the guy at my 2003 wedding who prompted my mom, my mother-in-law, and several of our out-of-town guests to ask, who is that good-looking guy with the long hair and pretty girlfriend? He was such a nice guy. He was the guy who many years later came to our New Year's Eve party to usher in 2017 and made a point of talking to everyone, especially those who looked like they weren't fitting in. He was the guy halfway up a mountain hike or halfway through a happy hour who would ask me, hey, did you hear such and such about so-and-so in OSMR? Not because he was a social busybody or social butterfly. His dad told me that Scott was actually, like me, an introvert. Rather, I think Scott had a genuine interest in knowing and connecting with all of us on a personal level. That's why you often saw him taking the time to pop his head in someone's doorway in OSMR, talking about whatever was on that person's mind. He was the ultimate listener. I don't know that I have one story that best summarizes what Fricker meant to me, but I'll share one that I think in part captures who he was. It was 2002. I was a fan of a crunchy power pop band from LA called Arlo, and they were playing a scrappy little music club on U Street called the Velvet Lounge. They were actually opening for another band that went on to become fairly popular. But I was interested in seeing the opening band. So I invited Fricker and a handful of other friends and acquaintances to the show. There we were, just a half dozen of us in the band. Midway through the set, the drummer and one of the guitarists started arguing. Before we knew what was going on, they were on the floor brawling as the other 2 band members continued to play. As the rest of us stood there dumbfounded, perhaps wondering if the brawl was part of the act, into the fray jumped Scott. Single-handedly, he broke up the fight and was later seen talking with both of the combatants in successive fashion. I asked him what he was talking to them about, and he told me he was hoping to get them to reconcile. For me, that event summarizes what made him special. Scott was someone who truly cared about people and human connection and made the effort to get involved in making those connections happen rather than standing on the sidelines. I knew I wanted to tell that story today, but I also sort of wondered what the hell it has to do with a library. If Scott were here, he'd probably say, cool story, bro. I knew why Scott was important to me and why he was important to others, so that prompted me to start thinking about why libraries are important. I turned to the Google and I found this quote. Quote, libraries are important cornerstones of a healthy community, and the reference resources in libraries are often unavailable elsewhere in the community. Our library is a unique and valuable resource. If it is a lifeline to the world and all the information in it. And I think that definition of a library clicked at least a little bit for me in relation to who Scott was to me and to us all. He was a cornerstone and connecting force in my life, in our OSMR and BLS communities, in his own world beyond BLS, as well as a unique and valuable, nay, invaluable professional resource and personal friend to us all.
Thank you, Randall and Bill. So we wanted to open it up. I know we all have our own personal stories and connections. If you're comfortable and would like to share, please do so now. Someone's got to start, though. John?
I had the pleasure of knowing Scott beginning in October of 1998, so slightly less time than Randall. The OSMR had at that moment been having a retreat up in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, and had a chance to meet him and had some of the same reactions. He was this person, and at that point he had been at the Bureau for about a year. And over the course of the next 19 years after that, an enormous amount of pleasure in getting to know him in many different ways, both professionally as a co-op and otherwise, but also interacting in many different ways here at the Bureau. Profoundly grateful for that opportunity to learn so much from him over the course of time, and as both Bill and Randall were saying, in different ways, also having the joy of seeing him interact with so many people in so many different ways.
We won't go around, so anybody can just jump in.
Well, it's hard to add to Randall's story, but when I came to BLS in September 1998, came with a ton of books, and Scott came down the delivery dock and helped me carry them all upstairs in boxes, which I then moved from office to office. So he was a great help from the start. So that's all.
From Bill mentioned that, you know, he crossed over into our Office of Field Operations and going out to a very different environment. You know, several of us didn't even know this department existed, and he opened it up to us and helped us, you know, in the development, becoming our friend, providing guidance. I worked on a JSM paper, and he was so good at, there's probably the resources he led me to that are resided here, but we were certainly a beneficiary of all of his knowledge, his friendship, and the guidance and mentoring that he could provide us in our new survey.
And I'll add to that. So I spent a large portion of the summer of 2017 with Scott traveling around. He cannot travel. He could not get the hang of it, but he was the perfect travel partner. He always helped carry my luggage and open the door. And that was the same summer that he and Buckley bought their house. And he was such a good husband to her because she was going through some rough times trying to close on that house while we were traveling the country. And he just was very patient. He's just a really good guy.
I will echo the theme we've sort of heard of where Scott was working with a lot of different people on a lot of different projects. He really, he and I got to work together on bringing sort of usability and survey methodology together, and we did that in a number of ways, and so that was a really great chance to bring those fields together. We put together the red book on the table is a book of his publications, and if you look through it, it's really amazing how many different people and different organizations Scott worked with and had publications from. So putting that together was really eye-opening about how much he had really, really contributed to the field and to everybody who worked with him.
When I started at BLS 7 years ago, I remember he came to my office, and he did this throughout my career. He would always come to me with some problem that he would pretend like he didn't know the answer to. He would treat me like I was some sort of expert, and it was very empowering. And he brought me in on a lot of projects, and he'd ask me what my ideas were and what my research interests were, and we grew a lot of projects from that. The other thing that he always did, which I wasn't used to, is he would always ask me about my personal life. One point he found out I had a friend that had a beach house, and he'd always be like, have you gone to Costa Rica? Have you gone to the beach lately? Like, what are you doing? And he would stop in and he'd say, okay, I have a work question, but before I ask you that, how are you doing? And yeah, I mean, it's like what everybody here says. He was really, really special, and I felt like he brought the office together. Everywhere you went, everyone I knew said how much they loved him.
Yeah, I have known Scott since early 2000, and when I work at CE office, and he's quite open-minded guy, and that's why I like him so much, because I work in the IT area, so he never treat me as like an IT person. He just treat me like his colleague, and so we did a lot of data analysis and work on some paper about the CE data with Lucilla, and after I moved from CEIS to BBAS, we still have some project working on. And I think in early December in 2017, Scott and I and another researcher, we are just finalized a research paper, and we were so happy because that is the last paper we committed we are going to publish. And then so after the paper is completed, Scott I ran over Scott this quarter. So and he said, "Happy holiday, Shirley. I'll see you next year." And that's the last time I saw him, and it's really heartbroken to hear the news. And I feel Scott just like the flower, you know. Everyone, if you touch the flower, you can feel the Scott's spirit. It's just like a flower. It's always keep with you in the spring. All these people that he contact with, and I like the flower he put here. That's really remind me about him a lot. I went to his funeral. I saw many of you, and I just feel he really bring us together as a family, you know, at BBAS, and he's such a special person. I'll miss him forever.
So I miss him for all of the reasons that you all said, but also because now there's not anybody to kind of kick me in the ass when I'm not being personal with people, or I'm not being open-minded, or I'm not being inclusive, because he would, you know, he'd listen to me and he'd be respectful, and then after a meeting or whatever, he'd come to my office and he'd go, "So, you know, you could have done that better." And I try to think, I say that sometimes in meetings even now, I'll try to put my Scott hat on and be open-minded, and so I miss him a lot. I think we'll take this idea over to the next room where we have sweets and cookies, and we can continue to share and reminisce. And thank you all so much for coming. We'll head right over next door.